Peace. Yes, this is F a Rap Critic. Yes, this is your boy Malik 16 from Plates and Crates. And no, I don't need help with the filters on my YouTube channel. Okay, that's a lie. I will not turn tech help down. So if you are somebody or you know somebody, leave that information in the comments. But there's no way that I could have just gave y'all one album review to launch off this channel. So I'm trying to give you two for the price of one. So by the time we get to the third video, we have a nice range of rankings to choose from. And so that makes this episode 2. We've made it, you've made it. And before we go any further, I do want to shout out my barber. You know, I don't know how well this cut translates to the YouTube screen, but I'll have you all know who can't tell. This is a very fresh cut. So if you're ever in the Bay Area, Fairfield, California, some people debate whether or not that's a Bay. I will not jump into that debate, but check out A Step Ahead. I got the illest barber with 2X chromosomes. She does her thing. And if you have not noticed from the t-shirt, shout out to the homies Josh and Nick from the Freestyle Table, one of the many dope events out here in the Bay Area. When the world was open, I won this t-shirt from doing my thing at a couple of those events. So allow me to pop my collar. Go follow them, because hopefully we get back together and do some great things when we can at the Freestyle Table. Now, if you have noticed the theme, all of this Bay Area talk, it makes sense for the album that we're talking about today, In a Major Way by E-40, a legend. And there's no way that I could have spent as much time as I've spent out in the Bay. Shout out to Oakland. But in Vallejo in particular, without acknowledging this album is like gospel here. And we're gonna go into it. And so, you know, a little background on it. This is a 1995 release. Most of you should remember this album with the presidential Rolex cover. Very much a moment in time. But this is the second major label release for E-40, but very far from being his first album. If anybody knows the history, this is an out of the trunk independent pioneer back when the rap game was still trying to figure itself out. So when we talk about terms like get it out the soil, get it out the mud, it's the definition of it, right? All right, let's jump into it. Category 1, the album itself. And the first dimension we're going to talk about is the quality of production. Now, one distinct thing about the Bay Area production, it often got lumped into this West Coast production category. Like it all sounds the same, but Northern California and Southern California are different in a million ways, and that also applies to production. Typically, California production leaned very heavily towards funk, but I would argue that whereas Southern California, LA sound took more from Parliament, Funkadelic, Northern California took more from the Roger Troutman school of funk. So that means there's more of a implementation of synths, electronic sounds, and, you know, that kind of element, that computer's puted, but more of that element, right? And that's going to be very evident on this album, because you could oversimplify the Bay Area sound and say that it breaks down into two categories. You pretty much have this funk category, and then you have this more bass heavy, drum heavy. You know, they employ way more boom bap than Southern California did. And then bass lines were dominant. And then silly sounds, like silly electro sounds, they weren't afraid to play with those. And I say silly because, I mean, when you think of a lot of classic Bay Area songs like Super Hyphy, and just lots of the Rick Rock kind of production that dominated in the early 2000s, and then some of the Mac Dre songs and things that are really regional, they're playing with sounds that sound like really, you know, elementary, but they work. It'd be the most gangster songs over these like real, almost silly sounds, but they slap, which is a Bay Area word. So you get that kind of production on this album. And you know, the more popular songs were handled by Sam Bostic and Mike Mosley, and that's going to be your Sprinkle Me's, The Bumble, Dusted and Disgusted. But then you have what I consider to be maybe the darker, deeper cuts And those are produced by Funk Daddy, Funk Doctor. Correct me if I'm wrong. And those are tracks like Fed, It's All Bad, and Sideways, which sounds like it could have came out yesterday because it's a precursor to hyphy. And this is what I'm talking about. It's that vibrating bass line that bounce, a bass line that bounces. That is the Bay Area sound, but it's a hard track because it's so slappy. Can't even think of a better word. It's slappy, right? And you could argue whether or not some of the songs on here sound dated. You know, you get to a track like One Love, and I think it's more about what was done over the track than if the song sounds dated. So something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're thinking about the quality of the production here. Which takes us to dimension 2, which is the cohesiveness of the sonic bed. And that's more the question of how does this go together? And what I think is done almost purposefully on this album is that right when it feels like it's time for a variation, you get it, which most good albums are, you know, you would hope they do. That's what they're supposed to do. Right when you've had, you know, 2 lighter kind of beats, you get to a harder beat. And this happens right on time on this album, right in the clutch, right when it's time to transition. You've had 2 kind of, you know, lighter instrumentation, silly sounds. You get more of that straight to the point, grittier sound, and it weaves in and out of that. So right after, you know, Fed and They Ain't Know, you get Bootsy. And so you're getting variation there, and it works, you know, because even on the harder songs, you might hear that modulated funky worm sound. And even on songs with silly sounds on them, you're gonna get hard bass lines. So it all comes together and it kind of works. So something for you all to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And to put it all together, we go to dimension 3, which asks the question of, is there an intentional mood and tone on this album, or mood or tone on this album? And that's a great question, because I think, ironically, the mood and tone is set on this album by the intro and the outro. So really the dialogue, the talking parts. E-40 is coming from this space of arrival, right? You can talk boss talk, you know, from day one. You know, T.I. came out saying he was the king of the South, but there's a certain point in your career where you arrive to it and the people are right with you, because it's been proven now. And so, you know, if E-40 is no stranger to albums and putting them together, putting his crew to the forefront, putting his label out there, this was the album that really made it serious, because it had already been tried and tested. And so he's coming out in the intro like, all right, y'all know who I am, y'all know what this is, but y'all ain't ready for what we're about to bring from our umbrella, sick-witted umbrella. And I'm just gonna give you, you know, another helping of who I am, but I'm getting y'all ready for what I am about to do with everybody. And that's from the intro to the outro. So even though in between that and the album, he takes you many places through different songs, that gets tied together by the way it ends. It goes out the same way it comes in. So I think that's where you get the mood and tone. I'd like to hear what you all think on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 4, repetition versus song distinction. Now, we already talked about the differences between the lighter fare and the deeper, darker fare on here. And what's funny is that E-40 is able to give you dark subject matter even over those lighter sounding songs. And you just don't realize it as glaringly because he does it so masterfully. Like, he'll talk about real heavy street stuff with a smile on his face, and you can hear the smile. And you don't get repetition of words and sounds, one, because there's not too many tracks on this album. This album is probably the expected length for a classic album. You know, it's just the right amount of songs. There's some skits in there to take up, you know, numbered space, but there's not more than, I think, 11 or 12 actual songs where there's a rap performance. And within that, E-40 doesn't waste words. This is a wordsmith. So, words are his thing. You talk about the guy that brought a lot of slang to the forefront. So, everything here is definitely deliberate. And, if there are repeated words, it's because, again, he's repping where he's from. He's spelling out Vallejo on a lot of tracks. You'll hear, he coined this way of using the B word with different vowel sounds, like the old Barney Apples and bananas, equals and baninis. Like he does that with botches and batches, and very clever stuff there. But no repetition in a way where it's like, man, he's saying the same thing over again. Same thing with the beats. Yeah, for all the funk and all the synths, there's just not any real repeated sound. And that comes from working with a variation of producers, right? You got Sam Bostic, you got Studio Tone, you got Mike Mosley, you got Funk Daddy, and there's enough of that where, it's spread out evenly. So something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, and that takes us to dimension 5, the content versus the amount of songs. I think I kind of said this a second ago. Because there's only about 11 or 12 actual songs, E-40 takes you into different modes of who he is. There's a song about, drinking, dedicated just to that. But, he gets real descriptive with that, why it happens. There's a song about sending love to people locked up. He goes into different spaces. There's a lot of flossing, but no one subject matter overwhelms the rest of them. It's pretty balanced as far as albums can go. But I would love to hear what you all think and rank on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Now, dimension 6, the features. We talk often on this channel why features are important. This album exemplifies that. If you're gonna have somebody who's such a character as E-40 is, and such a presence on the microphone, who clearly can hold down an album on its own, your features better be up to par or very important to how the album sounds. And that's what you get on here. From every feature, they just fit right on time, right? Where the features are on the album. It's not like song after song has a feature. They're spaced in a great way. And then they also complement E-40 style. So for every Celly Cell and Spice One who have like a faster flow, it comes right on time, because E-40 would slow his down where it would match up. And then you get just iconic performances on this album, like just Richie Rich talking on this album is something that has gone down in history, right? There's a story behind why he's only just like saying 2 bars on this album and then talking in between. There's a story behind Tupac's appearance on this album and why he couldn't appear in the video. Mac Mall, and then of course Be Legit, who has been, one of E-40's best collaborators from day one. People just love the way that they bounce off each other. I personally, do as well. They made plenty of projects together, and there's that grounded balance that allows E-40 to go different places because you have that anchor. And that's where a lot of the rappers go. It's interesting to hear when he's with the faster rapper, how he kind of becomes the anchor. And when he's with the slower rapper, he's allowed to be a little bit more experimental. So there's not one feature here. Of course, the star feature on this album is his sister Sugar T, who almost steals the show because she's got as much personality as him. And everybody remembers her verses line for line from coast to coast, man. Sugar T, shout out to Sugar T, man. Such a dope presence. I just remember her on the Lyricist Lounge show, and nobody ever gave the props, like, yo, that's Sugar T. So anyway, something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, which takes us to dimension 7, which is the question of, does the weakest song take away from the album? It's a great question. I don't know what would be considered the weakest song here, because 40 doesn't come down on any of his levels. You might argue maybe like One Love and Smoke and Drink might be the weaker songs because he really kind of dumbs it down to keep it on topic. But even his dumbing down isn't this dramatic plummet. Like there's not this dip where you're like, oh, this is too simple, this is too light. It's just he's focusing on one topic and getting real descriptive about it, and not a lot of room for, super duper clever or, lots of wordplay. But it's a good question. Maybe beat wise, maybe hook wise, you don't like something. People tend to like the hooks where they're singing on it. I think sometimes, depending on the sound of the singing, that could be a takeaway. There's the song at the end where Son is rapping. Maybe you feel like that kind of takes away, and it should have just been E-40 by himself because it's a little kid. But again, something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Now, that takes us to Dimension 8, Mass Appeal. This has been the long, the long toiled over issue with Bay Area rap, is that there's this comfort level. Bay Area rappers have embodied the spirit of independent hustle if they didn't invent it. You could say that they pretty much invented it. There's elements of the South as well, but Bay Area, I just remember them making the most noise about independently selling as much as rappers were selling nationwide out the trunk. And there's this, we're self-contained, we're cool here. Being geographically so detached from other parts of the map made it kind of necessary and vital, right? To kind of only care about your region, because who else is going to look out for you but you? And I think that is evident in a lot of Bay Area rappers' projects. But with 40, you could tell he had his finger on the pulse of what was going on, not just in the Bay, not just in Vallejo. Even the references he makes, he's quoting, East Coast rap all throughout, showing that he's on the radar. Like, he's got love, but he's gonna rap where he raps. And I think maybe that was in the mind going into this album. Like I said, there's a different air of arrival. So I think he was setting himself up for nationwide domination, or he at least was realizing, I think he said in an interview recently that he realized that he had fans all over, and the South was really, vibing with him heavy, and he was trying to capitalize on who was listening. And not so much caring about getting new listeners, but he was like, listen, y'all go and listen. If y'all don't catch it now, y'all go and catch it later, because this click thing is heavy. This sick with it thing is heavy. And I think that air is prominent all throughout the album. So while it's very, very much catering to a Bay Area audience, I think 40 had enough insight and foresight to see that he could spread the tentacles a little further. And so, and it did, Sprinkle Me was, I remember the first time I heard Sprinkle Me was my cousins in Atlanta were like, listen to this crazy song they got playing down here. And I was like, okay, this is different coming from, we're out in New York. That's hella different, right? But it's just, it speaks to where things were headed. And I think the proof is in the pudding. This being a platinum selling album, we'll talk about that more in the next dimension. I think there was an idea here that I can reach a wider audience. So something for y'all to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. He didn't have any features that were not Bay Area rappers, so it's not like he was going out of his way to appeal to a wider market. But I think, when we get to the rap performance category, we'll see there's little nuances that made it seem that he was ready to take it somewhere else. All right, so let's get to it. Dimension 9, the 3 I's: impact, innovation, influence. This impact of this album, of course, was huge because as the second major label release by 40, this took him to a wider platform. So there's gonna be 3 videos for these singles. These videos are gonna get played on Rap City now. There's gonna be posters in cities where maybe there weren't posters before. And it paid off. This was the album that got E-40 the widest recognition at that point in his career. Again, I told you the singles were being played in Atlanta, and you know, at least in New York by then we had heard about him. Now, whether we heard about him because of like, you know, other factors, Tupac stuff, it didn't matter. He was now on the radar, and everybody remembers that imagery, which is a part of the innovation. I think putting the presidential Rolex as the cover, which was a huge status symbol in the 90s, in the Bay, just in general. This is the Big Willie era, right? The Big Tama, Big Willie era that mattered. That had an iconic, you know, stamp on it itself. But yeah, platinum selling album. So it made the biggest waves in 40's career up to that point. And what it did, it also put Vallejo in the conversation. Before, when you think about the Bay, you think about San Francisco, but San Francisco didn't have super prominent rappers. You know, you had Forte, you had RBL Posse, but Oakland, you know, they had so many go-to rappers. 40 being like, not just a rapper from a city that you never heard of, but being the rapper. You're like, how is this guy coming out boss level when we never heard of him? You know, this was like really interesting. Now the buy-in is there. So I would say the impact is huge for the Bay and for Vallejo. Anytime a rapper comes out and introduces a city to the industry, they're automatically gonna be legends forever. And that's what 40 did. 40 let everyone outside the Bay Area know that Vallejo, California exists. And he repped it super hard on this album. And so as far as innovation, you know, let's not even get into how many slang words were introduced and brought to the forefront. 40 himself has said in interviews that he may not be the inventor of a lot of the words that he put in his records and in verses, but he wanted to make sure he definitely utilized them and they all came from the area. So he's putting Bay Area slang all on the map from this album. You want to talk about influence. Influence that alone, the slang words being used and how they carried into other rappers and just general the slang rotation around the world a lot of it comes from this album. Even flow wise, even the Izat, Shijat, Izzle Kizzle, like we'll get into that when we talk about the rap performance. So lots of innovation, lots of influence, but something for you all to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And that takes us to the final dimension, the overall timelessness and uniqueness. Now, even though I said a lot of the beats on this album may not sound dated, I do think as songs, some of them kind of are not gonna stand the test of time unless you're attaching memories and nostalgia to it. When you hear the singing on some songs, they might be kind of dated. That old style of singing. California rap was huge for a long time for using singers that sound like your auntie. And no disrespect to anybody, but I always tripped on that in the 90s where I was like, why didn't they get a young sounding singer? You know, I think East Coast was a little ahead with that. Or, you know, maybe California just has more respect for its elders, but you know, a lot of that old style singing makes it sound like more of an 80s song on some tracks than a 90s song. It works, but as far as standing the test of time, I don't know. Then you get a song like Bootsy, which is using a slang which, depending on who you speak to in the Bay, is a slang that will forever last the test of time. It still gets used, or it dates itself by using such a slang that's, you know, attached to a time in life in an area. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5. I think the impact is what makes this album timeless. It's definitely unique because E-40 albums in this era sound like no other album. So uniqueness, that's the pinnacle of uniqueness. I mean, the man invented a style. And we'll talk more about that on the performance segment. So that has been category 1 in all 10 dimensions. Join us, come back. We're gonna do category 2, which is the rap performance. I know I keep saying that, but if you have not already, take a minute to like and subscribe to the channel. And you know how it goes. Global hip hop community all day. That's what we build in here. We will continue these reviews. Until then, F Rap Critic, talk about it while I live it.